I'd like to welcome all of you. The Center at St. Andrews is happy to host the second in our Faith Journeys conversations. And the interest that I have in this is certainly to have us understand the varied faith journeys of members of our parish and how unique and varied they can be, how they have experienced God touching them, Jesus drawing them, the Spirit inviting them, in whatever words that people have to speak to them, so that we can understand their faith journey, but really it's so that you can all understand yours, so that you might begin thinking of your own faith life as a journey with direction to it, with key points of invitation and change and shift and so forth. So my interest is really in all of us developing an understanding of our own faith journey. So welcome to all of you. Today's guest is someone that most of you may know, Reverend Canon Dick Gillett, who is a marvelous member of our parish and a retired priest from the Diocese of Los Angeles. And we'll hear more about who you are, Dick. And I'd like to begin by asking you, when you think of your faith journey, and you think of some of the key transition points in your life, does one particular one come to mind that you may want to begin with?
Well, I think that in a way which I certainly didn't understand at the time, my interest in, as a faithful practicing Episcopalian and as a member of a strong Episcopal family, at some point in my youth, maybe high school, maybe even a little earlier, I began to notice a couple things. One was my dad, who was a very well-known and very conscientious life insurance agent in El Paso, Texas, where I was born, my family was. He treated people with such dignity, and I noticed that it wasn't just his friends. And I remember one moment when, it's crazy why I should remember this, but one moment in which I was going up in the elevator with him to his office, and at the time there were elevator operators, human elevator operators, and he treated the elevator person, you know, as not part of the machinery, but as a genuine person. He treated everyone like that. And I thought that is really interesting because, you know, this elevator person, he doesn't travel in our circles. So that interested me in the topic of what people do all day. And there's a book with that title by Richard Scarry, which some of you may read to the children or grandchildren, but I got interested in what people do all day. And that led me, as I decided to go to seminary, to the notion of what is work? And is there significance in work? And is there even theological significance in work? And it struck me early on in seminary that the church prays for those who work in this or that, but there's been very little interest for a long time, as far as I can see, in what you could say as a theology of work.
So when you went to seminary, you were already thinking about these questions of work and the dignity of work and the worker.
I was.
And where did you go to seminary?
Well, I graduated from Harvard Divinity School that's okay, you don't need to have your degree from an Episcopal seminary, which not all bishops would have done. And so he said, just live at the Episcopal seminary in Cambridge, Mass, participate in their worship, and so on. So somehow I read a book by an Anglican priest, Church of England priest, who wanted to connect with work similarly. And this, we're talking about the 1950s now, we're going way back. And this priest became a bishop in the Church of England, but his ministry was in the industrial town of Sheffield, England. And he began to really relate to working people in the steel factories in Britain.
Now, so I know that you, in your journey, you go to Britain.
Yes.
But where did you begin your ministry after you were ordained, and where did that take you?
That was a parish ministry in Newton, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, for 3 years. And I was vicar of a small church right next door to Newton. And I was also a curate at Grace Church Newton, which was a wonderful kind of apprenticeship.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then after that, where did you go? Where were you glad to go?
Right. Well, I decided during those 3 years that since I had been brought up with a lot of Spanish and spoken to some extent in our house, had a lot of Spanish in high school and college, that instead of just taking the normal quote-unquote route to a parish ministry in Boston, that I decided I'd like to go overseas to a Spanish-speaking country. So we ended up, Anne and I and our 1-year-old son, Frank, in Puerto Rico in 1963.
Oh, okay. So that's when you went to Puerto Rico, and did you have experiences there that were important to you in your faith journey?
Well, I had retained my interest in work, and I noted that there was the establishment of a new network in the United States called the National Industrial Mission. And I thought, well, I've read this book, I'm interested in work, so I'll follow that up and attend orientation to see if somehow or another I would like to go deeper into the practice of what was being called industrial mission.
And can you tell more about your experience down there? And were you in, what city were you in?
Our first 3 years was in Ponce on the south coast
Okay.
of Puerto Rico, and it was a large Episcopal church there, and there was an English-speaking service for expats, North Americans, continentals, they were called, living and working in Puerto Rico. But I was also part of the Spanish-speaking ministry at Santísima Trinidad, Holy Trinity Church. Yeah.
So now, as you think back on that experience, what are some of the next things that you noticed in your own faith journey that were really important experiences?
Well, I thought I'm really interested in this issue of work and how the church relates to ordinary working people, which it doesn't know how to do very well. And so an opportunity opened up, and the overseas missionary department of the Episcopal Church was amenable to my going, expenses paid, Anne and I, and by then 2 children. So we ended up for 1 year in a town in the industrial north of England, and that was a setup in which this priest in Sheffield, who was now bishop in Manchester, right there in the industrial north, said, okay, come, you can take part in a parish church in Barry, our town where we were, and you can go be in factories. You can visit factories in the area over a year's period.
Wow, interesting. Now, it reminds me of some of the worker priest stuff happening in France, I think even before that, in the Roman Church. Was that kind of similar?
Yes, well, yes, people would be amazed to know that there was a very liberal Archbishop of Paris in the 1950s, or maybe 1950 itself, who wanted to get back the working class, the alienated working class of France. And so he said, Archbishop of Paris said, I'd like to have a cadre of worker priests who leave their parishes and go to work full-time in the factories in and around Paris. And, you know, it's kind of a little-known story. 100 priests
really
left their parishes and worked as full-time workers. But for
now, was your situation similar to that, or was it different? I mean, were you working? It was different.
It was different.
Tell more.
Yeah. The Church of England, being the recognized, the established church in England, had so much clout. You could go to a factory owner or manager and say, would you mind if we put one of our trainees or our priests in your factory for a day or a couple of hours? And so the answer was, yes, go ahead. So my experience that year was a mixture of being in a factory and talking to workers. And then the most interesting of these was a steel mill in Manchester that made railroad wheels. And there were 1,000 workers and they made railroad wheels. But the fascinating thing was that the workers were from all over the former colonial empire. So there were a mix of people from Pakistan, from Jamaica, India, and they're having experiences having to do with racism interacting in the factory. But mostly I spent all day, once a month, in that steel mill, just talking to people, not doing Bible study, but just, what's it like? What are you doing? What are your thoughts, you know? And I found a big eye-opener in that they were almost all very intelligent, very aware of their situation, very articulate, and it came, you know, and the phrase, the dignity of work really began to assert itself in me and said, wow, this is a ministry that somehow has to find further expression.
Did you have experiences there in the factory, any that were important to you, or stuck with you?
Well, there was one which was quite striking. In the mill, there was we're talking almost about, we're talking about the mid-1960s, and we're talking about this factory that's almost, parts of it are like in Dickensian England. And a crucial moment in the making of a railroad wheel consisted of a device going up and down a railroad wheels between banks of furnaces. And so the guy driving this contraption, which had like a pair of sugar tongs out front, and he was protected in the cab. So the furnace door would open and this thing would swing around and go in and pick out 1,000-pound red hot steel ingot, kind of like a Tootsie Roll, and then run it down the track toward the end and put it under a big steam hammer. And the steam hammer would come down with 2 or 3 blows that shook everything around. And at the end of those 2 or 3 blows, there was a donut, which was the embryo of a railroad wheel. And
well, now, was that, I mean, was it dangerous work?
well, it was dangerous. It could be very dangerous because of the heat. And anywhere near that operation, you had to shield yourself from the heat of the furnace and of the ingot. But so one day I saw that the guy who was running the contraption was taking his tea break. And I said, wow, I see you're taking your tea break. What's it like to run that machine? And he gave me a triumphant smile and he said, well, I've worked 20 years at that machine and today is my last day of work.
And you happened to meet him on that?
Yes. And I said, so what are your thoughts on this, your last day of work? And he beamed and said, I've beat the system. And
what did that mean?
And what he meant was that I have endured this work. It's tedious, it's boring, it's dangerous. It doesn't allow much for doing other than this. And I've survived. That's what he meant.
How did that affect you?
Well, I thought, it confirmed my suspicion that there's so much of industrial work that is dangerous, boring, demeaning, and of course some isn't, because the satisfaction of holding a job and being well paid, which was inevitably the case in that period where industrial work was at its height. But so that's what made me see that, what are people feeling when they work?
Yeah.
And sometimes they feel good about work, like a nurse, a teacher, a social worker. Many occupations have great satisfaction.
And then others don't.
That's right.
Okay. Now, how did that affect you? You came back after a year there near Manchester.
Right.
You came back to where?
I went back to Puerto Rico.
Oh, to Puerto Rico.
And I said, I'm going to found an industrial mission in the city of San Juan, the capital city. And it wasn't like that. But I consulted with the bishop of Puerto Rico, and it was at a time in the church, if you think of the mid-1960s, think of all the ferment, all the change, all the experiments, all the students, the Vietnam War beginning to crank up civil rights movement, and the church itself was still, the mainline churches had lots of money. They were willing to found experimental ministries. And so I applied for one of these, wrote a grant proposal, and established an experimental ministry in San Juan called the Puerto Rico Industrial Mission, Misión Industrial de Puerto Rico, and got a board of mostly Puerto Ricans. It was an ecumenical ministry funded by extra money from the Episcopal Church and from other denominations, mainline, who saw this as an interesting experiment.
So then, what happened? What did you do? Or was there an event, any of it?
Right.
Important things that happened?
Right. Well, we frankly floundered around for almost 2 years. And my first thought was, well, we need to humanize the workplace, so let's have a course for first-line supervisors. And we found a team of people who thought that was a great idea and ran a 6-week course for foremen, first-line supervisors on human interaction. And it was a success, but it led to nowhere, and I couldn't figure out where to go. And then after almost 2 years, somebody said, well, there's a really interesting development that's going on in Puerto Rico right now. Why don't you see about doing that?
And what was that?
Well, Puerto Rico had been of great interest since the late 1950s in whether copper deposits were to be found in sufficient quantity so as to be mined in the central mountains of Puerto Rico. And the government, which had had a policy of attracting American industry, very successful policy, to Puerto Rico, thought that this would be a really good thing to do. To get copper mining going in Puerto Rico. It would employ people, it would spin off other industries that would employ more people, so forth.
Was that an issue that you chose to get into?
Well, somebody mentioned it, said, why don't you tackle this issue? And I thought, wow, this is a hot potato, because the only people opposing it at the time were the independence, political independence parties in Puerto Rico. And they were opposing it mostly on grounds they didn't want further U.S. development. They wanted autonomous development. But they had some concerns too.
So tell me about mining, copper mining. I know nothing about copper mining. And why was this important or not important?
Well, the usual way of copper being mined is open pit. And so you are stripping bare the mountains. Copper's not, as far as I know, found on the level ground there. It's found in the mountains. Stripping them bare, just if you know of what Tennessee looks like for coal mining, or Arizona and other places, or Chile for copper mining, you know that it's very impactful on the environment. And so that was a big initial concern.
So then, I'm hearing you say that the first couple of years that we were floundering, so I'm kind of noticing that in my mind, and I'm thinking, so I wonder if that's the way God works sometimes. You flounder a bit, and sometimes over quite a while, and then you find
that's what happened. And I think in my 60s I was a priest only 6 years ago. Gosh, am I up to this? Am I too timid to kind of take this on, because it would be a big thing to.
So did you let others do it, and you passed it up? Let this cup pass?
Oh.
Hurry.
I said, give me the cup.
Give me the cup. So tell us about the gift. Give me the cup.
Well, so we had a very good board of directors, and some of them either were directly related to the University of Puerto Rico, or as economists or environmentalists, and others were out and out environmentalists. And so we said, well, if we want to really think about this, let's talk to people who can inform us. So we had an investigation of all the factors that would be involved. And there was a particularly strong, very well-known environmentalist, and Maximo Serrano Vivas, who said, wow, yes, I'll help you on this. And he had an marine biology department on the south coast of Puerto Rico, connected to one of the universities. So we put together a position paper. We went to the Bishop of Puerto Rico, and the Diocesan Council considered this, and the Bishop of Puerto Rico said, I think this is not a good deal. I don't think we should go this route, and we should think of an alternative.
Alternative to the mining.
Right.
Oh, I see.
So anyway, the position paper and the proposal to him to take a stand was accepted. The Bishop of Puerto Rico put out a pastoral letter, and the pastoral letter went to all the churches in Puerto Rico. It didn't get a great deal of attention, but it did get the attention of the press. Episcopal Church in Puerto Rico opposes copper mining. And at that point, we would have thought, well, we're talking about the government of Puerto Rico, we're talking about copper companies, we're talking about huge power. And they're going to say, that's all right if the Puerto Rico Episcopal Church opposes this, it's not going to affect us. So it would have been kind of died except for one thing. And so that one thing was that the Episcopal Church, who had been funding industrial mission from the mainland, took note that the Diocese of Puerto Rico had opposed. So they said, well, this is very interesting. We have just published a big document which the former Bishop of Olympia, Stephen Bain, was instrumental in doing. Mutual responsibility and interdependence in the body of Christ. A big global declaration, like we're not just giving charity to overseas, we're listening to what's going on overseas and we're going to support where we can.
So the national church got behind some of the efforts you were involved in.
Yes, and the way they did it was very interesting. By this time, it had been lifted out of my hands. You know, we were still advocating in San Juan, but into the national church, and they looked at their stockholder portfolio, which every national church has, as well as every diocese, I guess. And they found that our Episcopal Church nationally had $10 million worth of investments in Kennecott Copper and American Metal Climax, the two companies that wanted to mine copper. So they then asked the other denominations, the Methodists, the Lutherans, the United Church of Christ, a couple of Catholic orders, religious orders, and they all had investments amounting to $30 million worth of investments. And so
did they divest then?
No, they didn't. Oh. They said, we will go and have stockholder actions at the annual meetings, but by that time they formed a committee to decide what to do, an ecumenical committee, and we're working very closely together. And they said, yeah, we'll protest at the annual meeting, but we're going to do something different, and we're going to put together an ecumenical team of people to go to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the place where they want to do mining, and we want to have open hearings, public hearings. So this committee was now headed by some very influential people in the Episcopal Church, so they did the protocol thing to do. They contacted the governor of Puerto Rico directly and said, we'd like to do this. And the governor of Puerto Rico couldn't very well say, no, don't do this. So he accepted, and the hearings were held over 2 days. The testimony was tremendous. Responded with all kinds of people from environmentalists, economists, workers, people in the mining area who came down, proposed mining area, and everybody, and the government testified too in favor of the mining. But the copper companies boycotted the hearings. So the results of the hearings were put together. The news media covered these hearings extensively, page 1 every day, because there was so much new news coming out of it that the government had tried to suppress. And One of them was a contract, the contract proposed by the copper companies to the government, which revealed that they really wanted 10 times more acreage than they were saying publicly for 30 years. So
what eventually happened?
Yeah. Well, I hope we're not talking too long. But what eventually happened was that the tide began to turn. The government began to be very wary of this proposal, and no movement was made for the next year. And by the end of 1971, the copper companies withdrew because the government would not go further. So,
well, now, how did that affect you when you saw you went through all of that experience, and then you saw in the end the copper companies back down? How did that affect you, and how you saw yourself doing ministry, your own, your own faith journey?
Well, it was a period, as you can imagine, of intense activity, and it was such an exaltation to see that rare instance of church collaboration coming together, that it seemed like, really the sphere within which the divine providence, the Holy Spirit, God acts, is so much wider than we sometimes think it is. And it just made me aware that, we are too timid sometimes in pushing for what we think ought to be. So it was that kind of sense, and of course, it really stood as the highlight of my ministry.
Wow. So it sounds like your thinking and your way of understanding your own personal faith journey, it was very much in context of a larger picture of the Spirit, of the Holy Spirit working. And I know, and we do have just a few more minutes. I know eventually you went on to the city of Los Angeles. You did very important work there, supporting labor rights, I believe.
Right.
And you were eventually honored by the city of Los Angeles for your work. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I think early on, Terry, I had a sense that the sphere of God's activity is almost endless. And I remember a quote, I don't know, from C.S. Lewis or J.B. Phillips, one of the popular Anglican writers, who said something like this: "It is a mistake to suppose," a shocking statement, "it is a mistake to suppose that God is interested exclusively or even primarily in the church."